My name is Kay Sargent, and I'm the Global Director of Workplace Thought Leadership at HOK, and I'm happy to share with you today our findings on sensory processing in the workplace. Over the past 8 years, HOK has undertaken significant research initiatives on the topic of neurodiversity and neuroinclusion, and really thinking about sensory processing and cognitive well-being. Our team has conducted research, surveys, focus groups, and last year we really undertook a more intense assessment of not only the neurodivergent population, but the mixed neurotype population. And we want to share with you the findings of that study today. So again, I said over the years we've done multiple research initiatives, and we're happy to share all of that background information that really dives deep into understanding not only what neurodiversity is, but how we should be addressing designing for neuroinclusion in the workplace today and in complex building types. So here's a lot of that research and links to that material that we are happy to share. But for this specific initiative, we really wanted to focus in on some of the findings from our past and elaborate on those. So we know that everyone's brains function differently, hence we are all neurodivergent. But that sensory processing is impacting all of us, neurotypicals and neurodivergents. But what might be annoying for a neurotypical individual could be debilitating to someone that is neurodivergent, because in many, many cases, they might feel that more specifically. So for this specific research, our goals including identifying preferences and design elements that are impacting individuals in the built environment, identifying those preferences of the neurodivergent population and how they compare to those of the mixed neurotype population, and really starting to identify some design solutions that will help our clients and designers create spaces that are more welcoming for a larger percentage of that population. So this was all based on the initial research that we did, the survey in 2022 on a purely neurodivergent population. And we had 202 individuals respond to that. And there were some interesting statistics and some significant things that came out of that. So first of all, one of the most important things for us was this notion of nothing about us without us, meaning to truly hear directly from the neurominorities about their specific experience. But most of the research to date that has been done on neurodiverse individuals has really focused on youth, and historically women have been underrepresented. And this research initiative was about working individuals, and 69% of the respondents were female. And so we had a great mix of different neurotypes, and you can also see the hyper and the hyposensitivities, and just a good cross-section to really build our understanding. Last year, we expanded on this research and we went to a mixed neurotype, kind of a typical office setting with a variety of individuals in that. And what we found is in that pool or that sample size, there are about 16% of those individuals identified as being neurodiverse, which, as you can see, is well within that US average. 55% were female, and we had a really good cross-section of individuals with various neuro conditions and neurotypes. What we thought was interesting is 90% expressed some sensitivity, hypersensitivity to sensory processing in the built environment, and about 73% expressed some hyposensitivity. Now, that's interesting because those numbers are pretty significant. And it could be because we all now have a heightened sensitivity to the environment because of the conditions we've been through with the pandemic and what we're touching and how close we are with things. It could be that there's just an increased knowledge, but it could also be that that sample size was specifically for designers and architects who we'd like to think have a better understanding of the built environment. But it was interesting to just kind of see that heightened sensitivity that was reported by that group. Now, what we know is that we are not all the same. Some impairments might look like this. Others might look like this or be invisible. Some are temporary, some are permanent, some are situational. But again, 70% of all disabilities are invisible, meaning you may not realize that somebody is dealing with certain challenges. And while we know that we are all neurodiverse, people that are neurodivergent tend to kind of fall outside of those set norms about how we process information. And this is a natural reoccurring variation that we're seeing, but it can include individuals that are autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, even Tourette's syndrome. Now, the World Health Organization changed the way they defined kind of a disability about 2 years ago. And they basically said that a physical, cognitive, and social exclusion can occur at the point of interaction between an individual and the environment where there is a misalignment between the two. Or, put more simply, individuals have impairments. If they're in environments that are well suited for them, then they aren't necessarily disadvantaged. But if they're in an environment that is misaligned, then they will struggle and they are at a disadvantage. Now, when we started our research, 1 in 8 individuals reported to be neurodivergent. But today that number stands at 1 in 5. Yet fewer than 50% that are may even know it because it went undiagnosed for a long time. But people that identify as being neurodivergent tend to be entrepreneurs, they tend to be very creative, outside of the box thinkers, and very artistic as well. So you're in good company. And what we're seeing today is that the employed workers with disabilities stands at a record high of over 22%. And it is estimated that 25% of the US population is living with some form of a disability, but 70% of those are invisible. And we're seeing that as we're casting a wider net to try to employ a greater pool of individuals and find that talent, we're welcoming more diversity into that workplace that is causing us to really take seriously how we're designing spaces. And as a result of stigmas and fear of exposure, we still see that only about 4% of workers are really truly self-identifying as disabled. So we still have a long way to go to really help people feel comfortable. Now, one of the students that we spoke to gave this quote that we love, and he said that we are freshwater fish in salt water. If you put us in fresh water, we will function fine. But if you put us in salt water, we will struggle to survive. And we all want to design environments where people can thrive. But since the pandemic, the world has shifted. Now everyone has a heightened sensitivity to their surroundings. So let's talk a little bit about human functioning. We've got sensory, cognitive, and behavioral. Sensory functioning is really the transmission of information via the senses or even that receiving of that information. Cognitive functioning really delves into different thinking styles and how we process information. And then there's behavioral functioning, which is how we interact with the world around us and our pattern of actions. And these can vary across all neurotypes. So it really has to deal with our sensory thresholds. So in the middle, you might have individuals that are neurotypical. They kind of fall within that set norm of how I might respond to stimulation in the environment. It doesn't mean that you might not have a heightened sensitivity to sound or maybe acoustics, but it doesn't necessarily go to those extremes. But in those extremes, we have individuals that fall into that hypersensitivity category, meaning they prefer less sensory stimulation, maybe more organic or simpler patterns, more natural or neutral colors, clean and orderly space, less background noise and clutter, and maybe more personal space and boundaries. But on the other side of that, we have individuals that are hyposensitive. Type O sensitive individuals might actually need additional stimulation. They might need layers of texture, more saturated colors, plenty of visual interest. They might need to listen to music, or they might need to move and fidget and physically engage with the space to really kind of process things. And of course, this is impacting all of our senses, not just the 5 we learned about in kindergarten, but there really are 8, and that includes kind of our internal sensations, our body position and balance, on top of taste, smell, touch, visual, and hearing. And when we start to get sensory overload, what we know is that that can cause a physical manifestation, right? So sensitivities to light or irritations with smell can lead to exhaustion or fatigue or increased irritability or even physical things like headaches. And those sensory distractions, or those smells and sounds and visual clutter, can lead to cognitive distractions, that loss of focus or discomfort. And that leads to loss of engagement and productivity, meaning presenteeism or poor recall, stress, burnout, and dissatisfaction. All things that we try to avoid in the built environment today. We also know that individuals that are neurodivergent may have what we call spiky profiles. So we all process things differently. There's perceptive reasoning, verbal reasoning, our memory, and our processing speed. So that perceptive reasoning really is our ability to take in visual information and organize it, interpret it, and use it for problem solving. Verbal reasoning is that ability to understand and hear. And when we think about learning styles, some people have to hear things to really comprehend it. Others have to visually see it. Others have to physically interact to be able to do that. And when it comes to memory, it's our ability to recall information. And some people can have a photographic memory, while others have a very poor memory. And then, of course, you have that processing speed, or our ability for our brains to function, understand something, and respond to that. And we all do things at different speeds and at different levels, and we process things differently. But individuals that are neurodivergent tend to really kind of have extreme highs or extreme lows when it comes to their cognitive functioning. And it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. It all has to do with how we process information and the best way for us to be able to receive that and to function. So let's dive into the comparison between the neurotypes surveys that we've done. So on the left side, you're going to see the neurodivergent population responses. And again, 100% of the individuals in that first survey were neurodivergent. On the right side, you can see the results of that mixed neurotype population, where we had probably about 16% of the respondents identified as being neurodivergent, and the others really kind of responded as being neurotypical. And we even broke it down a little bit further for that mixed neurotype so that you could see just across the ages how things might be impacted. The interesting thing on this chart is that if you'll note, the 20-year-olds identified a lot more with being ADHD versus the 60-year-olds. And that might be because for many of the people in their 60s, this was never diagnosed, and they may not even truly fully be aware of that. So over time, of course, that has kind of come off. But 85 to 90% of adults with ADHD were never officially diagnosed. But when we're struggling with this, it could mean that we are neurotypical passing, masking, or camouflaging. We're trying to pretend like nothing's wrong, we're just the same as everybody else, even though we just might be processing things a little bit differently or have more severe reactions to things, because that stigma associated is still not 100% worn off. Now, when we dive into the work styles, for individuals that identified as being neurodivergent, you can see the different work settings that they were in. Many were working in open spaces. Many were also working remotely or from home. But for that mixed neurotype, there was far less individuals that were working remotely or from home. Now, this also might be that the first study was done in 2022 and the second was done in 2023. So as the return to office movement was shifting, that could also kind of affect the numbers here slightly. But many individuals that are identified as being neurodivergent are actually asked or encouraged to work remotely because people are afraid they can't accommodate their needs in the built environment. Of course, we believe that all spaces can be designed to be able to help individuals process that. But in some cases, individuals might be better off to work remotely where they can be in an environment where they have total control over things. When we talk about sensory input, and we start thinking about what are your hyposensitive to, well, that neurodivergent population came back with a very, very strong response to auditory or sound. But so did the mixed neurotype population. We're almost 77% in the neurodivergent population and 71% in the mixed neurotype. Both are closely followed by that visual stimulation that is impacting us, kind of varying, whether it's 43% for the mixed neurotype up to 62% in the neurodivergent. But it means that we need to be acutely aware of what's in people's line of sight and how we're designing the spaces to not overly clutter or overly stimulate individuals. It also means that about a third had a heightened sensitivity to smell, which can be a very, very powerful sense. And women tended to, even though they wanted more visual stimulation, tended to be more sensitive to visual clutter, where men tended to be less sensitive to both touch and to smell. So when we think about what are those things that we're hypersensitive to, both the neurodivergent and the mixed neurotype population had very similar responses about sound or lighting or acoustics. It was just to the degree that it was impacting them that might have varied more significantly. All right, now let's look at the hyposensitivities. And again, on the left, when we look at the mixed neurotype versus on the right, on the left is the neurodivergent population, and on the right is the mixed neurotype population. And so when we look at this, we can also see that visual stimulation now tends to be one of the stronger elements that people need, whether it's strong elements. Maybe it's being in less boring spaces, right? Like nowhere in nature is a rectangular white box, and that tends to be very demotivating for a lot of individuals. And so people that need that heightened sensitivity or heightened sense of things, visual stimulation is probably one of the easiest ways that we process that. But they also had a heightened sensitivity to sound, and meaning they actually needed more sound. Not necessarily less, but it's important that we note that not all sound is noise and not all noise is sound. Like we want to make sure that we're creating spaces that introduce the right type of sensory stimulation for individuals. And we also notice that women tended to have and need more visual stimulation than men. And men tended to be less aware kind of their body position and their body movement in the spaces. And similarly, when we looked at that hyposensitivity between the two groups, there was a lot of commonalities about things that they felt were either positively impacting them or that they might actually need more of. And you can see there's a great example of someone saying that color is important for them, right? Like too much gray and too much white can be actually very depressing and non-stimulating for them. And when we think about what are the tasks or those modalities of work, how are people actually spending their time? Well, when we think about different settings, and we know there are kind of those 6 modalities of work, the things that we are doing when we come to the office, there's that concentrate and focus, there's contemplate and refresh, there's that communal processing, things we're doing in a, answering emails or things we're doing in a studio together, but it's kind of alone together type work. Then there's that creative work. There's meetings and convivial and congregating, and then there's convivial space. social, interacting, and connecting, truly focused on that. And we know that we want to create hypersensitive versions and hyposensitive versions of both of these. So for the hypersensitive versions, you might be able to have spaces that have less visual stimulation, or you can have more control. They can block themselves off, and they really can limit the amount of stimulation that they have in those spaces. Where for hypo settings, you might have someone that doesn't necessarily want to be in a confined space, but they want to be able to move and fidget and engage, or they might want to be in the middle of a very active space. So it's important that we kind of create that balance. And so when we think about this, it's low sensory threshold to more high sensory threshold spaces, just by the nature of what those activities are about. So when we dive even deeper into that and we say, what type of spaces is that mixed neuro population doing versus that neurodivergent population? Well, we'll start with the neurodivergent population, and you can see on the top the percentage of time that they felt they were spending in each one of these kind of work modalities. A lot of time in that concentrative and focus space, followed up by that congregating or processing, those emails, processing information in those group settings. And for that mixed neurotype, again, same thing, about 41% were doing kind of that concentrative focused work, and about 19% said that they were doing that communal space. Now, it's interesting to note here that research studies say that most people spend a lot more time doing that communal processing work than they usually estimate. But this notion of people still need to have space where they can do that concentrative, deep thought and that individual work is really important. And so we need to think about creating spaces that people can focus in, and thinking about how they're spending their time and what percentage of time they really are spending. So in this case, 50 to 60% noted that they were spending the majority of their time doing those solo tasks or concentrative and communal work. And then when we start really thinking about meetings, people seem to believe that they spend a lot of time in meetings. Per this, it was about a fifth of their day that they were spending in meetings. But again, that can vary across industries and across genders and across generations as well. So our hypothesis really was that individuals that are neurodivergent are feeling things more acutely. And we really base this off of Christian Lindström's notion that autistic individuals are like canaries in the coal mine. Our needs aren't actually different from typical people. They're just more intense and more specific, meaning that they might feel things or sense things more quickly. And again, what might be debilitating to them might just be an annoyance to someone who is neurotypical. And so we really need to understand how it's impacting those individuals, because it doesn't necessarily mean that sound and acoustics aren't impacting neurotypicals. It just may not be to the same level or to the same degree. And it really truly is impacting all of us. So when we start thinking about those challenges and what are the things that are challenging people in the built environment, well, sound, temperature, and light ranked at the very top, both for, as you can see in white, that neurotypical response, and for the mixed neurotype that's shown in pink, we had the exact same issues that were coming up as the number 1, number 2, number 3 in all of these cases about what was impacting people in those spaces. What's interesting to note too, though, is that we all kind of have this heightened sensitivity, that we've been desensitized to being in public spaces because so much of our time over the last 3 or 4 years has been working independently or in solo spaces. And then we look at the next things that are impacting individuals, and the number of people in a space and your proximity to those other people in the space ranked next after sound, temperature, and light as being some of the biggest impacts. Now, somebody asked us once if this was a result of COVID, and I can't tell you for sure because, quite frankly, this question wasn't asked in many surveys beforehand. But we can say that It absolutely is a consideration today going forward, just about how close people are. And in some cases, it's not only the number of people in a space, it's the lack of people in a space that is negatively impacting people as well. And you'll see that in the responses shortly. There's also a common belief that people that are hypersensitive should be in enclosed spaces or work remotely. And what we found is that more people were bothered by being in confined or enclosed spaces than actually a lack of enclosure or being in open spaces. But that had often not been asked, and so it wasn't coming up. And so it's important that we understand that what might be important for one person isn't necessarily the answer for somebody else, and that sometimes what you think might be the cure could actually just be adding to the problem, right? It's not necessarily the right solution. So understanding that enclosed space is not the answer for everyone is important to really realize and dive into. And then we also realized that pattern, color, and texture had a huge impact on individuals as well, but maybe not to the same degree as some of the other factors that we were looking at. And in many cases, it's probably because those things are in check in most spaces and are kind of played down. But if they were, if you went into a space that had a really bold color and a really bold pattern and really significant texture, that could set some people off and be very, very debilitating to them. Maybe even more so than some of the other factors here, but often we don't necessarily see that. So those things, because they tend not to be as much of a problem, didn't get the same percentage of response maybe as some of the other categories. We also need to understand that individuals with ADHD often seek out kind of that textural stimulation, and they might have less or need less audio or visual input. And individuals with ADHD and autism often tend to have this hyper sense of focus, and they tend to be able to find patterns or things that maybe others don't necessarily pick up as well. And some individuals really are kinesthesis learners. They need to move, they need to physically engage with the space to be able to interact. So giving people options and choices is important. Now, this is all based on this notion that indifference towards people and the reality in which they live is the one and only cardinal sin of design. We could argue there's probably a few other cardinal sins of design, but we need to understand that we are designing for individuals. Hence, it's critical that we create spaces where we understand those elements that are impacting people, and we've designed space that is well suited to meet those needs. Now, we took all the responses from our survey and we broke it down into different groups. We broke it down by gender, we broke it down by age group, we broke it down by neurotype. We found some interesting things in the survey when we looked at the genders. Women in the survey tended to have more sensitivities than men. They tended to work remotely at a slightly higher rate. They tended to have hyposensitivity or need more sensory stimulation when it comes to visual elements, and they really needed that to be ordered and structured. And they tended to be less challenged in open and communal spaces and prefer warmer temperatures. Men, on the other hand, happen to be less sensitive to touch and smell, a little less aware of that body movement and position, and they tended to be less challenged by pattern, color, and texture, and prefer cooler temperatures. And the other interesting thing to note here was the non-binary individuals tended to spike really high and tended to have a heightened sensitivity to the sensory stimulation, something we probably need to dig into a little bit more. Now, we also know that there's neurodegeneration, and over time, as we age, our ability and our sense of taste and equilibrium and hearing and sight, all of those things start to diminish. So as we have an aging population and we're dealing with more and more individuals that are staying in the workplace longer, we need to think about that neurodegeneration and how it's impacting the spaces that we're designing. We also notice when it comes to ages that the under 30 group tended to spend more time in kind of group settings, congregating, learning, and socializing. That mixed group in their 30s and 60s tended to be pretty stressed. They needed more time contemplating, and they needed more refresh spaces. They're dealing with maybe young children and aging parents and more managerial responsibilities. And the group over 60 spended the least amount of time in those group settings and learning and contemplating, and really kind of did more individual type of work, which isn't surprising either. So we asked, what are the design strategies that would help you feel more comfortable in the built environment? And these responses that you're seeing on the page now in the pink are from that from the neurodivergent population. And we think about, we can see that there's things like access to natural daylight, quiet space for focus. And if you look down, you're going to see probably 4 or 5 down, you can see private offices, but then right below that, after greenery, is open plan. So again, what works for one person may not necessarily be ideal for somebody else, and creating options and choices is important. And then we layered on the responses from the mixed neurotype population, and the percentages and the responses tend to be in sync with a few exceptions. That second group really had a heightened preference for greenery and plants and biophilic elements. And also there was a note that they wanted access to people-filled spaces. And again, this might be as the return to office movement continues and more people are coming back. Having people sit in spaces that are underpopulated can feel wrong or not right, or have low energy that is negatively impacting individuals as well. So that was an interesting finding of this survey. And we looked at the things that were uncomfortable. Again, they tended to be very, very much in sync. Noisy spaces, lighting, temperatures, again, just reinforcing the previous findings that we had. So our hypothesis and our finding was, when you design for the extreme, you benefit the mean. Meaning that when we design for individuals that have more acute or severe responses to sensory stimulation, we actually benefit everyone, because everyone in the space is still being impacted, but perhaps to a lesser degree, and it may not be as debilitating, but they are still being impacted by it. And so when we can take these design considerations into place, we're really going to benefit every single person. So we looked at what were the top design strategies, and we asked that question. And for the neurodivergent population, we got these top 13. Access to places where you can have choices where you sit, spaces that allow you to move, either physically engage and or away from something that might be bothering you. Having a dedicated space can be really important for some individuals, while others want options and choice. Access to natural daylight, being able to sit in low traffic areas, dedicated quiet rooms, spaces to retreat to where you can kind of control the amount of stimulation you're getting, spaces where you can adjust the lighting level or even turn it off, spaces that incorporate natural elements and biophilic spaces, spaces where you can adjust the furniture or it's more ergonomic, where you can have reduced clutter, or even screens to block sound and visual distractions, and in spaces that enable visual connections and kind of clear lines of sight, so you have a good understanding of what's coming, where you are, your position, and a sense of what's around you. And when we asked the mixed neurotype, it was fascinating. We got the same 13 top responses, but in a slightly different order. Now again, this could be because we're dealing with architects and designers who might value or understand the benefits of adjustable ergonomic furniture, so that scored higher, but other things may not necessarily be as impactful for them. We also would be remiss if we didn't talk about kind of this being a three-legged stool. We need to design spaces that people can be successful in, but if we don't have those operational strategies, and if we don't think about individual adjustments, then we're not truly serving that population. And we are 100% focused on kind of the work settings and the space and the environment, because that's what we do as professionals, but we highly encourage that individuals really think about those operational elements, those HR, the retraining managers, and enabling individuals with those individual adjustments as well, so they can truly be successful. We believe that there is a compelling human and business case to be made for ensuring that we approach the design of workspaces to help address mindfulness, health, safety, well-being, and inclusivity. So we want to thank our 2023 research partners, One Workplace for the ONEder grant, and Target and Genius Within, who helped us with our initial research and findings. Because we firmly believe that we are no longer just designing environments. We are designing the experience, and we want it to be a positive, inclusive one for everyone. Thank you for joining, for hearing the results of our latest research and findings.